Morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It's delighted to see so many people here. We are, I'd say, definitely at maximum gross weight, and we're ready to take off. I have a special guest myself this morning. I'd like to introduce a young lady by the name of Kim first. Kim is the producer-director of a brand new movie that she's just finished, and it's just been released, called Flying at the Feathered Edge. It's a life story of Bob Hoover. And she's agreed to come back kindly in a couple of months' time and tell us about how she made that movie, the research she did, and the time she spent with Bob Hoover. So, Kim, thanks for coming today. Stand up. You've got a very friendly crowd when you come back. I just want to comment before we get started. We had a range of reactions to our speaker last month. You may remember Major Sean Merlin.
Yes, sir.
You guys were vocal about the way he spoke and what he spoke of, some good, some bad. So I started thinking to myself, well, I wonder what he thought about your lot. So I didn't have to wait long, because next day he sent me a very nice email, which I'd like to read for you. He says, Pat, it was my pleasure speaking to your group, and thank you all for the signed poster. It will serve as a fun reminder of the rewarding experience of presenting to such a fine group of men and women. Whenever I have the opportunity to interact with veterans and folks with such knowledge and experience, I always leave more invigorated to serve and work harder to perform up to the standards of the generations that served and sacrificed before me. Thank you for allowing me that opportunity, Semper Fi, Major Sean Merlin. So that certainly says a lot about the man and a lot about the Corps. So to our speaker today, before we get into that, I'd like just to give you a reminder that next month, April 30, we have a gentleman by the name of Kent Kresser coming to speak. This will be a rare opportunity to see one of America's foremost businessmen. He's got a tremendous track record with this man. He took over Northrop Grumman and changed it from really a failing company into a powerhouse. It's now a $28 billion company. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about those days and the future of flight. So if you get the chance, don't miss it. Ken Kresser's got a big reputation. He should be a very interesting speaker indeed. So now to today's speaker, and I want to thank Pat Groves particularly for introducing me to our speaker. And thanks to Philip and Kelly for hosting him last night and putting him up so well. It's a pleasure to introduce Jim Martin. Jim is a 1963 graduate of the US Air Force Academy. He earned an MBA degree from the University of Dayton in 1972. While on active duty, he flew worldwide routes for the Military Airlift Command in C-135Bs and C-141A and B aircraft. In 1967, he was assigned to the F-100D aircraft and flew 289 combat missions in Vietnam. Following his combat tour, he attended the Air Force Aerospace Research Pilot School at Edwards, and later flew experimental and developmental flight test at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In '73, he joined NASA's Ames Research Center at Moffett Field, where for 25 years he flew numerous flight research programs, primarily involving power lift, STOL, rotorcraft, and airborne science aircraft. At the time of his retirement from NASA in 1998, he was Chief of Flight Operations at Ames. Jim also served concurrently in the Air Force Reserve for 26 years and retired at the rank of Brigadier General. He currently is self-employed as an aviation consultant, test pilot, and a corporate pilot, and he's accumulated over 20,000 hours in more than 150 types. Coming up, Jim, you're a pilot's pilot.
Thank you all for inviting me over here, and it's always a pleasure to be around pilots and tell the stories. It's been, thank you, Pat, for the great opportunity and the accommodations you gave. Before I get started, I wanted to kind of get one thing straight, that I've been warned that my voice makes gay men sleepy. I can't tell my crossback jokes. So we'll get on with it. Oops. Okay. Philip? Okay, now it's working, I think. Yeah, it's working out. It was off.
Good job, Philip.
It's nice to have some techie people here because I'm not, and I'll apologize in advance. These are my homespun slides that I sat down. I haven't done a PowerPoint slide in 15 years or so since I left NASA. And so these are my own thing. Patrick kind of covered my background. I started flying, actually the first flight I had in T-33 was 1959 when I was a cadet. Went out, after graduation I went to pilot training at Vance Air Force Base, included T-37, T-38, and then got assigned to Military Airlift. It was called MATS at the time, Military Air Transport Service. The C-135B, I only was able to get a few trips in it before the squadron I was in converted to the 141. More about that later. The Vietnam War was building up, and the Air Force had a policy to not involuntarily make people serve a second tour. So they went out and grabbed anybody they could. So that's how I got into F-100s. That was really very much a highlight of my flying background, was flying the Hun. I know there's a couple of Hun drivers around here that keep me honest, but it was a great airplane, and I really felt that was probably in the top tier of everything I've been able to do. After that, actually it's kind of a funny story and how your life can change in a moment. I was at Phan Rang in Vietnam, and I went up to the bar one night, and there was a fellow there from Edwards, and had a few beers with this guy, and it sounded like the program that they had back there at that time was really kind of exciting. And I went down to the tent the next day where they had old records and forms, and I filled out one and applied for the test pilot school, and by golly, they took me. Went there in 68, 69, and went to the test wing at Wright-Pat. They found out I had some 141 time, so I had more fighter time. Bob will probably verify it. I had more F-100 time than everybody over in the pilot set, except for Bob. And so they were sending Bob Ettinger and other guys to training in Luke, and I said, hey, hello. Didn't work. I stayed in 141. Turned out to be a pretty good job. After that, I didn't think my talents, if I had any, were being used, and I bailed out of active duty and went to NASA at Moffett Field, and was there 25 years. Some of the highlights we'll talk about, the Harriers and power lift STOL airplanes. And I also got a job in the reserve at Travis on 141s. I was in the same squadron for 15 years on 141B models. Retired from NASA, got into corporate aviation. Started out, Pat Grove right over here is the guy who got me started. When I retired from Ames, I wasn't sure what I was going to be doing, and I think I was sanding floors in the house, and the phone rang, and it was Pat. He said, hey Jim, you want to go flying? And I said, yeah, Pat, I do. And 17 years later, I'm still at it. Thank you, Pat. So some of the highlights were the Lear 35, and I'm still flying the Falcon 2000. I got into racing. One of my customers that I did kind of brought him into the jet world. He had a King Air, and he needed somebody to babysit him for a while. The insurance company wouldn't let him fly by himself, and a mutual friend of Pat and I's introduced me, and I started flying that guy. And he wanted to get into racing. He bought an L39, and I went through the pylon racing school in 07 and raced that year, and it was a bad year for the races. We had 3 fatalities, and my family and others decided maybe I ought to end my career right there, so I stopped racing. And then I picked up little test programs here and there. This was my first airplane. Now, that particular airplane is the only one I could find on the internet the other day. That's a C-135B model. This aircraft was called Speckled Trout, which was doing a bunch of research projects, but it's just representative of the C-135. Now this is one going machine. It's really the airframe of a Boeing 720. It's equipped with TF-33 fan engines. and it was a huge improvement over the old C model water wagons with the K-57s. This aircraft, I only went on 3 trips, one of which was around the world, supporting U.S. embassies from Saigon, Bangkok, Rangoon, Cairo, Madrid, other places. It was a great opportunity for a second lieutenant to do that. We also had, this aircraft would fly to Wake Island, from Travis to Wake Island, and then to Clark Air Base, and it could fly all the way back to Travis from Clark. It was a 14-hour leg. This airplane, empty, is a little over 100,000 pounds, and it'll carry almost 200,000 pounds of fuel. So burning about 10,000 pounds an air, you can do the math. The thing will fly way more than most of us wanted to say. Again, the squadron I got assigned to out of pilot training was slated to get the 141. And there's 2 models of the 141. The one in the background, this is a Lockheed PR picture, because they wanted to show the great new size of the B model. They put plugs in the before the wing and after the wing to make it quite a bit more capable. It's keeping with the Air Force policy of taking a perfectly good airplane and stretching it and loading it up until it's marginal. You can see it had refueling added to it at the top of it. And that's one of the more challenging things you can do with one of these things is refuel. They had some of us reservists doing that. It's interesting. Anyway, when I got back from training, which was in Oklahoma, the first aircraft hadn't even been delivered yet. So they wouldn't let me go back to the 135 because the Air Force says once you've trained something else, your brain's been completely wiped clean of the old one, so you can't do it. There weren't any others, and when the first one came in, which was about April of '85, you had to be a colonel to get anywhere near that airplane. So I bought a house in Fairfield and worked on the fence in the yard. And finally, they started coming in. 1 or 2 a month were being produced at Lockheed in Georgia. And I did get a few trips, and following that was when the Vietnam buildup started, and that's when I got into F-100s. They sent me to Cannon Air Force Base in Mexico. And when I started flying the hundreds, I realized I had made a big mistake when I got out of pilot training. When we were making our choices at pilot training, the fighter guys were all sitting on Nuke Alert in Europe, and it didn't really sound very exciting. And the MAC guys were flying all over the world, flying a great airplane, and it sounded like a better opportunity at that time. I think I made the right choice. I got to fly a lot of different airplanes this way. There's the old Hun. I was at Van Rang. It was during the Tet Offensive in '68. We were pretty busy. That's how I got all those flights. So we were flying 2 or 3 missions a day at times during the Tet Offensive in '68, which some of you may have heard of. A great airplane. It's an honest airplane. It has some low-speed handling issues. I was going to show you the saber dance, but we don't have time for all that. You've all seen it before. It ends up in a fireball. It's not real pretty. And I went to Edwards. I thought I ought to throw one hero picture. I promise this is the only one. That's Captain Martin in 1968 at the Air Force Test Pilot School with the zip in the background. We had 104s was part of our curriculum. We did Zoom climbs and did a lot of fooling around, flying up the Owens Valley at near Mach 1, flying by the campers at 50 feet. It was a great airplane for going straight. Turning, not so much. It had a pretty heavy flight controls in it. I remember you get in the pattern with this airplane and horsing around the pattern 3 or 4 times, actually your arm would get tired and land because of your arm. It's the only airplane I ever remember flying where you wear yourself out pulling that thing around. When I got out of Edwards, they spotted some multi-engine time again on my background, even though I only had a couple hundred hours in 141. But this was my first project, and you wonder what the heck the car's doing there. At the time, and most of you old-timers will remember if you're Air Force, they had those base ops vehicles that used to go out during a storm and measure the slipperiness of the runway. And we all realized how ineffective it was. There was almost no correlation at all between what the the new leader said and what the actual conditions were. So the Air Force contracted with NASA, Langley, back on the East Coast, to do this program. They had a runway at Wallops Island that had a bunch of different test sections and different grooving patterns on it. We started out there. This car is a Ford Galaxy with a 500 horsepower engine in it. And they even hired a race car driver. I'm not making this up. They had a race car driver because this car would go down here 200 miles an hour. And it had a diagonal braking system, so you could run it on the test section of the runway and max brake it. And it had instruments on it, so you could measure the slipperiness of the runway. And then the 141, you can see the back end open, they could drive that thing in there. And we would do the same test with the 141. We would slide it down the test section of a runway. We ended up testing 40 runways around the country. Doing the wet stopping distance, they hired big tanker trucks to go out and flood the test section right before the airplane landed. We'd go skidding through that, do the measurements, load it up, go to the next base. And that winter, the first winter I was back at Wright-Pat, we started testing snow-packed and icy runways. So we'd go into base ops looking for the worst weather in the country, and we found it was K.I. Sawyer and places like that. It was a good start for a test program. There were some others. We don't have time for them, but I was a good tour at Wright-Pat, but I didn't think they were using me much, and so I failed. And with a short period in industry with my in-laws, I got hold of my NASA colleagues from Langley, and unfortunately a lot of us get jobs in the test business when somebody else dies, and unfortunately Ames had a fatal accident with their Condor 990, and the P-3 collided over the golf course at Moffett Field in 1973, and they were looking for a replacement for the, again, C-141. You can see it in the center part of that picture in the back. These are some of the aircraft that were there, say, mid-80s mostly. The aircraft on the left is a DC-8-72. That aircraft we flew it all over the world. We did a lot of polar research with it. Prior to that, we had 990s, and the 990 was very limited in range. It could go like that at hell, but it was short range. And the DC-8 was a great improvement as far as the science was concerned. As far as the pilot was concerned, it flew way too long, way too far, stayed in the air way too long. And it was, it was like a 3 brown bagger kind of airplane. But you could take off in one of the, like Christchurch, New Zealand, go to the South Pole, orbit, you do your thing for 4 or 5 hours, and land at Punta Arenas or back to Christchurch, and you still have 2 or 3 hours worth of gas on the airplane. The 141 is strictly airborne astronomy. It has a telescope in it. I got another photo of that would show how the cavity opened in the telescope. It was a 17-ton rig in there that floated on air bearings. The 130 did a lot of Earth scanning. Just talked to Patrick about that a little bit. We did some missions in Australia, out in the outback and out of Townsville. It was a fun airplane to fly. It was mostly low level, down the deck, doing the microwave scanning and what have you. The center aircraft's a U-2. It's an ER-2. It's an adaptation of the Air Force TR-1. And left and right, the Lear T-38 we always had for proficiency. Kind of nice to have the T-38 out there on the ramp every day. You just tell them you're ready to go, and it was always up field up ready to go. That little airplane in the middle is called the Y-03. And that aircraft was developed by Lockheed Sunnyvale in the mid-60s to do low-altitude surveillance in Vietnam. They built 12 of them. I think half of them crashed over there. It was kind of underpowered. But we got it at Ames to do helicopter in-flight noise measurements. It had microphones on the wingtips and the tail, and the Army had a mission to try to reduce rotor noise, so they would join up on us and fly different quadrants and different speeds and conditions to measure noise, and they'd do modifications on the rotors, and we'd go do it again and again. It's kind of an interesting airplane. I was the junior guy at Ames when they decided to get that. They sent me back to Champaign, Illinois, and I'd never flown a tail dragger before. And when they said do wheel landings, and I said, what other kind of landings are there? It took like, I'm going to say, oh, maybe 10 or 12 stops, because it only had 25 gallons of fuel in it. So we had to stop a lot. And I remember it's pretty darn slow too. It cruised about 9,500 knots. And going along, I followed Route 66 most of the way. I was looking for lower terrain to get around the Rockies. And I did see school buses passing me. The King Air we used because of the one aircraft that's not in there is our tilt rotor. I'll show you a picture of that later. As a King Air, we got it to chase the tilt rotor because you needed at least two vehicles to chase a tilt rotor. You had to have another helicopter when it was in helicopter mode, and it would do 300 knots. So we needed to have something like a King Air. So we used to do all of our trash hauling and picking up parts, and that's a King Air 200, nice airplane. Black Hawk on the right side. We did a lot of nap-of-the-earth sensors, head trackers, FLIRs, that kind of thing, Army, and then the gunship on the left, the Cobra, same kind of thing. This little programs that came up from the Army, and some of our support aircraft. There's another better picture of the Y03 in the middle there. The AV-8C was, we had two Harriers there. One was our research aircraft, and this one was used for proficiency. Most of the times the research aircraft's on the ground, and this is an airplane that I would highly recommend that you stay proficient in. It's basically a 12,000 empty weight airplane, about 12,000 pounds, and a Rolls-Royce 404 engine that puts out about 25,000 pounds of thrust. So it's a hot ticket, and it doesn't matter if you got the brakes on or not. When you put the power in, it's going to go where the nozzles are pointed. There's the King Air, some of our support aircraft. I never considered myself a rotary wing test pilot, but I did get to fly quite a few different aircraft, rotary wings. I probably accumulated maybe 500 hours in helicopters. I could use the point here, I think. Whoops. Is that it?
Yeah.
Is that it? Oh, there it is. There's the cavity, and there's a spoiler right ahead of that. So this thing opened up into the night sky. The reason for having this kind of rig in an airplane is that far infrared energy is attenuated by water vapor in the atmosphere. So this aircraft could go to 45,000 feet, and there was less than 1% of the Earth's water vapor above that. And so it could read infrared. And trust me, most of the stuff these guys were doing, I had no idea of the kind of science. And they were always good about giving me the reports, but they were usually something like they had discovered a new carbon radical in the galactic center. And you can stay up all night reading that stuff. I never did get much of it. This image right here, the orbiter was having some heating problems on different parts of it, and they asked us to do a scan, so we went out to Hawaii. That was really a tough job out there. And we picked up one of the orbiters while it was belly up to us, and it flew through it was a big development problem because the telescope doesn't slew very quickly, and the focal length's only like 2 arc seconds or something like that. It's a pretty narrow window, but we were able to get this image, and they were able to determine where the loads were in heat. This aircraft is now flying out of Edwards. It's the Sophia. It's called the Stratospheric Observer for Infrared Astronomy or some such thing. I never got anything to do with it, although actually I was involved a little bit in the development of it. I'm frankly surprised that they pulled this off because it took 20 years basically to get that aircraft going. And I don't even want to know what it costs. It's pretty expensive. This is one of the things that I did understand was this is the planet Uranus, and the C-141 discovered that it had rings around it. Look at it. There's, again, nice picture of the airplane. It was pretty. When I went to Ames, I was the only guy that had any 141 experience at all, really. So I got to fly that thing every time it flew for the first 2 or 3 years. And it was nice when some other people came along that could relieve me from it. Here's our 2 Harriers. This is definitely a highlight in my life. I went down to Cherry Point to get checked out. They were going to give me 2 or 3, several regular checkout in the airplane. And of course, the Marines had a big surge in requirements, and I did get 2 backseat rides in the T-88A, and the other pilot, Bob Gertis, some of you probably know him, the late Bob Gertis, Ron Gertis, excuse me, Ron, wherever you are. We kind of checked each other out in the airplane. This one is the Y-88B, and we, over a period of, I flew it over 12 years, over a span of 12 years, and we did various experiments in it, a lot of which, toward the end, we started developing flight control laws and displays for the Joint Strike Fighter, which is now, has a VTOL version, as you know, the F-35. But we did develop a strategy called translational rate command, where the stick in the hover mode becomes a command to translate the airplane. So when you pull back on the stick, normally the houses get small, and push it forward and the houses get big. In this airplane, when you move the stick forward, it moves forward. When you pull back, it backs up, and left and right and so forth. And the throttle becomes vertical speed. So you just dial in the speed you want vertically, and it maintains that. Now, when you take this out to sea, it's really quite a challenge, because the control laws were based on putting this aircraft aboard a Spruance-class destroyer in a sea state of 6, which is a 20-foot swell condition. So things are rolling. The landing platform is above the roll axis of the ship. So the ship is moving vertically 20 feet and rolling plus or minus 10 degrees. So the deck is translating quite a bit. So you need a pretty active flight control system to be able to do that. You can't see the deck either, by the way, from the cockpit. So that was quite a challenge that we did. A little scary, honestly. Yeah, you got lights are. One of the things we did was to measure this flight control system and its effectiveness. This is a picture looking straight out at the Harrier in a hover from these in the foreground. Whoops, let's go back one. You can see these devices right here. They were hung on a crane, so you could get X, Y, and Z guidance. And it had at the belly of the aircraft was a reflector. It was a prism, and they had a laser reflector. Most of our tests were done over in the Central Valley at Crow's Landing. It was a Navy auxiliary field. And one of those of you who've been around the area know they're pretty noisy. In fact, it's extremely noisy. But the farmers over there were the only people that ever were out there. Sometimes I know they're probably all wearing hearing aids now, but they could track this aircraft with an accuracy of less than 6 inches. So they could measure your performance pretty well. There's just another shot of that's what it looked like from the side. They hired this crane to put those targets up there. Now this is the quiet short-haul research aircraft. And I was a project pilot on this. We made the first flight at the Boeing company in Seattle in 1978. This particular picture was on the cover of Aviation Week in July of '78. Just as a quick rundown, these engines were acquired from the Air Force from the A9 program. That was the aircraft that lost to the A10. And so we got 6 engines from them. The body of this aircraft is from de Havilland of Canada, Buffalo. NASA had used the Buffalo fuselage for another project prior to this called the Augmenter Wing, which I had a chance to fly over. But this was my project, and it uses upper surface blowing. You can see the burn marks on the upper surface blowing flaps. You use spoilers for lateral control and for as well as lift dump, and also direct lift control. So the wing was entirely new, and it was built at Seattle by the Boeing company. And we had an exciting first flight. At the end of this presentation, for those that want to hear it, if we still have time, I'll go over some of the things that I've learned over the years. Some of you may have learned the same things, but we tend to make the same mistakes. But it was a mistake on my part. I didn't stick to my guns as well, and we almost lost the airplane on the first flight because they installed gyros backwards, and it went into an uncontrollable roll oscillation. It was really exciting takeoff. It was one of the videos I was going to bring. Actually, I've been on the road for a week. I was supposed to go home Sunday and get my videos together. Some techie guy like Pat could have showed me how to take some clips out of it.
Hey, Jim, if you send them to us, we can put them up on the website.
Okay, if you want to see that, yeah. It's a little hairy. The Boeing, to make a long story short, the Boeing pilot and I had a lot of arguments about how the cockpit ought to be on this airplane. And he was afraid that the Boeing pilot got first flight bonus. And that's quite a bit of money. And he was afraid if he had another pilot in the airplane that he'd have to split it up. Well, I was a government pilot and I wasn't going to get anything. And I was thinking about the long term. We flew this airplane over 10 years doing research projects. I always felt like all the systems ought to be on the right seat, and the pilot that's evaluating the aircraft would sit in the left seat, didn't have to worry about electrics or hydraulics or anything. Well, he wanted everything over on that side. And I kept winning all these battles. But when it came down to the first flight, there was a lot of discussion about having control augmentation. Should it be on, should it be off? And I'd flown other programs where at Edwards where they wouldn't let you have anything on. It was like, make it as simple as you can, fly the airplane in a safe mode and configuration, and then bring these things on in time. And I found that it was good advice. This pitch set, was it successful in getting him to agree to have the pitch augmentation turned off, which turned out to be very oscillatory as well. But when the Boeing company, in their effort to be thorough, after we did all the taxi tests, we were ready to make the first flight, they took all the gyros out of the airplane and recalibrated them, and sure enough, Murphy's Law strikes again. They put them in backwards, and we damn near lost the airplane. This was an exciting thing too. This is of 1980, the United States Navy had an admiral that had decided, because of all the military cutbacks through the Carter years, that they wanted to develop a fleet of aircraft that used powered lift, and they could deploy, as the Brits did, these smaller carriers that had powered lift aircraft on them. You could make 5 times as many ships and deploy them in many more places. So the Navy sent a team out. This is from the Carrier Suitability Branch. You can see the Navy guys here. That guy right there was our LSO. And this fellow is the best of the pilots, but he broke his leg and he couldn't fly the sea trials with us. And that's Bob Ennis, the famous Bob Ennis, that was probably the most experienced power lift guy in the world. And then that's me. I probably should know more hero pictures, but that doesn't count. That's another test team there. And so in 1980, we went, after doing a field carrier landing development at Crow's Landing, using a Fresnel lens, we went out to sea on the USS Kitty Hawk, and that's us coming aboard. You can't see in this picture, but there were about a half a dozen sailors out there holding marshmallows on sticks. The Air Force pilot was coming aboard. The sailors weren't too wild about our mission because during the field trials at Crow's, they determined they had a deck handling guys out there, and these cables, that resting cables, were being damaged by our airplanes because you notice there's no hook on there. We stopped it with Brigs, and it was breaking strands on those cables, so the sailors had to get out there and take these cables up every time we made our landings. Not popular with them. CD-63s, the USS Kitty Hawk, it's in back in storage again, I think, up in Bremerton, Washington. A highlight of the Q was flying at the Paris Air Show in 1983. This is a picture of our spectacular takeoff. That year, Airbus was demonstrating the A320, I think it was. And Boeing was up there with their 767, and they were kind of competing. Well, the boss of the air show, and of course, you've all heard of accidents they've had there over the years, and some of them pretty nasty. That Russian SST made a heck of a mess over there. And so you weren't supposed to do any maneuvering below 100 meters. you know, we don't do meters, you know, so. So we had this takeoff where we just bend it right off the ground and do this spectacular takeoff. This thing would take off in two or three aircraft lengths when it was light. And I did a lot of air shows around the West Coast with the thing, and it was spectacular, really. And so I got called in by the chief, by the head of the, you know, the, what do you call him, the DO or whatever, it's the Paris Air Show. He says, "Monsieur, you maneuver your plane below 100 meters, and you have assumed to be crashed, and you're no longer flying in the Paris Air Show." So after that warning, we cleaned up our act. But one thing I told this guy was, this Airbus was doing the same thing, and nobody else could do it. Only the Airbus was allowed to do, you know, this kind of a rip it off the ground and turn it. It was a lot safer maneuver for our airplane. In fact, the director even told me confidentially later, he says, "I know it's safe for your airplane to do that, but I'm under orders, we can't do it." There's a picture. This is actually an F-20 that was that Northrop, right? Bob, Northrop, right? You probably flew that, didn't you? They were there that same year. One thing that's, I know I'm going on a little bit too much here, aren't I? But this F-20 was really a damn nice little airplane. And they were going to sell these internationally, and unfortunately they had an accident doing an air show in Korea, I think it was, and that kind of ended it. But one thing that was cool for us was we brought all of our own equipment. We had our X-15 over there 2 years prior, and we found out that if you want something, you better take it, because you can't depend on the French to bring anything over when you need it. Well, they believed the French, and they came up 2 or 3 times during the progress of the air show, which goes on about 10 days, and they didn't have a starting unit. They needed a huffer, and we had one. Well, that, just to make it long story short, we didn't buy any drinks while we were over there. Because we got them started 2 or 3 times. And if you miss your window over there, when they say, "Okay, here's your window," if you're not out there, you're done. You don't come out late and reschedule or anything. You're done. So that was quite a nice experience. The biggest story of that whole thing though was getting that airplane over there. I'll save that for another time. We flew 18 stops across the Arctic to get that airplane over there. It was designed for a 1-hour test mission in the local area. And anyway, that was exciting. Now, this was a program I worked on for a couple of years. It's called the ASCA, which is a Japanese word. I remember asking the Japanese test team one time, "What the heck does ASCA mean?" And he said, "Flying bird." I said, "What's an appropriate name for it?" Kawasaki, that was a Kawasaki C-1 transport that was converted, similar to what we did with the QSRA and the de Havilland aircraft. This is another probably gotcha kind of thing that they developed engines. This is the first very large Japanese engine they ever tried to develop from scratch. It turned out to be kind of a problem. But I was able to go to Japan on several occasions, and they also sent a team over to the U.S. It was a nice cultural exchange. I learned a lot about how the Japanese do business, and they learned a lot about the way we do business. Over here, the pilots kind of run things a little bit, and over there, their engineers run things. The pilots are very passive, and it takes them forever to make up their mind, but they're very consultative. They don't seem to like strong personalities. So, but I got along with them okay. I did one thing, quick story. I had traveled to Japan a number of times with my, military airlift as a reservist and an active duty. And we're always looking for junk to buy, when you're traveling. I bought one of these headbands. It's a kamikaze headband. When they came to the U.S., they were real businesslike. Hardly had ever smiled or had a joke, and we, went to lunch with them and had meetings with them and all that. And it came down time to have the first flight for the Japanese pilot, and I was going to take him up in the queue. And I said, something needs to be done to loosen this group up a little bit. And I said, I don't know, that's kind of a religious thing, the divine wind and all that. And I said, the heck with it. I put that thing on when we went into the ready room to get suited up for the flight. And this was a gamble, I have to agree. But I came out there wearing that kamikaze headband. I'm flying with the jacket. I want to tell you, it took the room down. They wouldn't let me take it off. They all run out to their cars and get their cameras. True story. Okay, now this was my first encounter with an unpiloted aircraft. This is an oblique wing. And it's the biggest piece of crap you've ever seen. I don't think I ever flew an airplane that got me more sweat. We're down, and I wasn't even in the air. I was in a trailer in the ground. This was at the Edwards Dry Lake Beds. A lot of funny stories about it we don't have time for, but basically, it's a miracle. It only flew 3 times. I made all the flights. And it's just literally a miracle that that thing survived those flights. With the wing skewed, and in that position, there was so much trim drag on it, it wouldn't maintain level flight. It was extremely short coupled. The only thing you had going for you was it had a TV camera looking out the nose, and that's basically all you had for guidance. And I had an engineer calling out airspeeds over my shoulder, and that was about it. It had a lawnmower. It would sound like a 2-stroke engine. It was like a McCulloch chainsaw. And every once in a while, when it fly over the trailer, you could hear the damn thing. And it's a little weird to be doing that. It turned out, even though they had surveyed at the Edwards Dry Lake Bed for EMI, this thing, when it got above 1,000 feet, it was getting EMI from the Highway Patrol's transmitter. And it was surging the engine, and the wing was moving all over the place. The control room's yelling at me, "What the hell are you doing out there?" They did a pitch up and a half-turn spin and came back the other way. And I said, "I didn't do that." And then you think you're losing the airplane, and you go below 1,000 feet, and all of a sudden start flying again. You know, okay, we can do this. And it led to this aircraft, which I understand Mr. Rutan is part of your group, or he was at one time. He actually designed this aircraft. It was built by another group, but this is the Ames Dryden 1, another scissor wing, and this aircraft had a 60-degree sweep on it. And it was described by one of the old Dryden pilots, Bill Dana, as he described the handling qualities as a 3-dimensional PIO when the wing was skewed around. I flew there. That was actually a picture of me when I was flying up there. Our Lear support airplane, infrared telescope right there. 45,000 feet. I took this airplane out. We did some classified programs with it at a Quatchel. And I remember going through Midway one time, and some guy had ferried an airplane across, it was from Duncan Aircraft back in Lincoln, and he saw the airplane enter the pattern and land at Midway. And he came running out to me and said, "How the hell did you get this damn old Lear 24 out here?" And they looked inside and says, "Oh, the aircraft was completely full of fuel tanks." And we still couldn't make Hawaii. We had to go through the Aleutians out of ADAC to get it down here. That was a good experience. We did a lot of zero-G flying with this aircraft. We qualified every monkey that flew on the orbiter was qualified for this airplane. Not a good deal for the monkeys. These little monkeys had personalities, and yet of course we have all kinds of stories about the monkeys. But one of which is the ones that were real calm, that like the zero-G, they just sit there and put their little hand on the cage and stuff. Unfortunately, they got dissected when they came back from their flights in the orbiter. The crazy ones lived. It's Condor 990. You can see the speed bumps, the monster shockwaves there, very rural. NASA, I mentioned that we had lost one. That's how I got the job. They had another one that we were flying all over the place, and that aircraft also was lost aboard a takeoff down at March Air Force Base about 1982 or 3. And they did a high-speed abort because they heard the wheel exploded, blew a hole in the wing tank about the size of a basketball. And I think they were lucky. It was very unfortunate because JPL was doing the experiment. It was early days of synthetic aperture radar, and they lost everything. It burned down to nothing. One reason I had suggested they use March was because it was a SAC nuclear weapon base, you'd think they'd have a crack fire department. There was so much for that. They didn't even come out there. They still tried to charge us for burning up the runway. I had no idea at that point that an airplane could melt down like that. There wasn't much left but little pools of aluminum out there on the runway after they. Here's a DC-8. That is a golden machine. Now it's hard to compare with the 135 because these are CFM56 engines. That was one of, third or fourth generation fan engine. They're really phenomenal. But that gave the scientists all they wanted, made the pilots less interested in flying this thing. It did a lot of world stuff. We did a project out of Tahiti, out of Papeete, and they were looking at pollution that was coming from different continents. And one mission on this airplane, I'll tell you real quickly, I was out there because I had something, they actually named something after me. They were looking for particulate in the various atmospheres. So we go down to the deck 50 feet and then climb in a spiral in a pattern up to 40,000 feet. And we did that 4 or 5 hours and they couldn't find anything. All their models were breaking down. They did all their computer studies. And so the scientist comes up in the cockpit and he says, Jim, let's just go back home and we got to redo all this. And I said, well, what altitude or airspeed or whatever, what do you want? And he said, just pick something. He was disgusted. All his models weren't working. So I picked an altitude. I don't remember what it was. We're zooming along, and all of a sudden, a great amount of excitement occurred in the back. They found what they were looking for. And it was this plume. They called it a plume. It's a, particulate from forest fires and stuff like that. I think it was coming from Australia, actually. Anyway, they could tell where it was. They could detect parts per billion. Anyway, in the debriefing, I had to go to part of those, and they ended up calling that the Martin plume. So I actually had pollution named after me. Quite a distinction, isn't it? You know anybody that's got a plume named after me? This thing's not working. Okay. Philip? Oh, the battery's dead. Oh, there we go. Now it's going too fast. Okay, Black Hawk, we don't talk about it too much. You can see the NASA's worm on the tail. These aircraft, all those helicopters, were owned by the U.S. Army. This is a great aircraft, by the way. I got a chance to fly it some, and we were doing map of the Earth flying with passive sensors on it because they didn't want to emit anything because then that could be used as a homing device by shoot down stuff. And so the philosophy we developed with this thing, and by the way, I do not advocate map of the Earth flying. I mean, most of us are fixed wingers anyway here probably, but that's pretty hairy stuff. Get down below the trees, and they like to equate it to like a horse and a rider going through the woods. The rider guides the horse, and the horse knows to step over the logs and miss the trees and that kind of stuff. So that's what this does. The pilot is down in the weeds, and the helicopter senses things, wires, stuff like that. Hopefully. That's what I say. Okay. Well, you can either go way in the heck up in the air to get down in the weeds, and the Army does both of that. I think getting way in the hell up is a smart choice, but getting down in the weeds, the field of fire from the enemy is much reduced. This is our XD-15. This, I didn't fly, I wasn't on a project pilot on this, I did get to fly it. It's an incredible aircraft. Ames had a history in tilt rotors. They had an earlier one called the DC-3, which used reciprocating engines. And it was basically about 1 million rivets flying in loose formation. Very underpowered. This aircraft was very successful. By the way, I was going to mention several of these aircraft are, you're getting old when they start showing up in museums. This aircraft is in the Smithsonian, and that little 81, the pilotless aircraft, that's, when you come down into the Uvar Hazy Center out at Dulles, and you're walking down the ramp, look up, you'll see that little thing hanging from the ceiling there. And you know who flew it. But this aircraft is a huge improvement for the Marine Corps because their mission is to put a bunch of Marines on a beachhead, and prior to this they used H-46 helicopters, With the V-22, which was the outgrowth of this, they have a much larger standoff distance for their ships. Their ships are far less vulnerable, and the aircraft can go, close to 300 knots with about half the power of a similarly sized helicopter going half the speed. So it's really an incredible improvement. Oh, I got to go fast. Okay. One of the most exciting missions I did in the reserve was the deep freeze mission out of Christchurch, New Zealand. And we went down to McMurdo Sound. This is an ice runway. It's 8 feet thick. And the Navy promised us it would hold us up. And by golly, it did. And one of these, when you get down there, you compute a point of no return. This was back in the days we still had some navigators around, and they would do all that. That's way too complicated for pilots to try to figure this out. And so, because when you started down into the Antarctic, you're going to put it down there somewhere, and then the weather would change very rapidly, and so you can see it's a pretty nice day that day. It was a good mission. We did 16 heavy lift missions to the Antarctic, our unit, every fall, from mid-September to mid-November. Here's a picture I took. This was a 35mm slide. That's Mount Erebus in the background. Oh, and I got into racing. I mentioned it briefly. This is the L-39 I was flying, and this is a flight surgeon, actually. A Navy flight surgeon that was flying the T-2, and he's just passing me because he was about a hell of a lot faster than we were. The owner of this L-39 did not want to modify the aircraft to race, and it was pretty stock. So we had a group that were the real racers in the gold heat, and then we had these guys. We were just out there having fun mostly. The T-2 ended up in the gold category because he actually won that year. The T-33 was raced that year, and he was having control problems, ended up getting disqualified. He was actually a faster airplane. But this one, I shouldn't divulge our secrets, Daryl, but we were actually staging passes and stuff for the crowd when we were flying this underneath. It was just a lot of fun, and again, if you ever want to go into a room where there's a whole lot of testosterone, go into the pre-flight briefing here before one of these races. It's amazing. I got into the corporate flying there toward the end. I did some Part 135 with this airplane. This is the Lear 35, great airplane. Really enjoyed flying it. One of the side things is if you're a celebrity watcher, we ended up with a lot of, the high rollers charter these things, and met a lot of those folks. Some of them are really nice. And this is what I'm flying now. In fact, I've got a trip tomorrow down to South America. This is a Falcon 2000. Really nice, comfortable way to travel. Test program I did a couple of years ago. Aviation Partners developed blended winglets for the Falcon. They had done some things. They did all. If you fly in a Boeing 737, you're flying with their winglets. One thing that I hadn't done was FAA certification. I've done a lot of research flying, but if you look up the serial number, if you ever get a chance to fly, this is a Falcon 2000 EX Easy, serial number 91. Don't fly in that airplane. I've never done any FA stuff. We just beat the hell out of this airplane doing flutter tests and everything. And I'm amazed that it didn't break something, but it didn't. And this one I'm flying back and forth. That's my little airplane, the RV-7. That's the Grand Sierra Resort right there. I'm right on the flight line at Reno International. And we're out of time. Just a couple of things that I've learned along the way, that I'm sure some of you have learned the same things, but the closest I've ever come to busting my ass in an airplane was I was a first lieutenant probably by then in the C-141, flying a load of Marines out of Clark to Saigon in about 1965, and the number one engine went into full reverse just as we rotated the nose. And having flown the 135, we had an in-flight thrust reverse procedure on that aircraft. So when I was checking out the 141, they said, well, we don't have to worry about the thrust reversers opening flight. It can't happen. Well, I had two it can't happens in the 141, one of which was a prototype 141 we had at Wright-Pat that I picked up from the factory, and it came out in the reverse at 0.82 Mach at 30,000 feet to roll the airplane about 120 degrees. And another can't happen. So when somebody, and over my test career, I've sat down with engineers and they said, what? Time to go. Get the hook. They're getting the hook out. They just said, it always picked up my ear when I heard some engineer briefing a project says, don't worry about that, it can't happen. The priorities, I think, I learned that mostly in Vietnam. A lot of the missions we flew they're almost all close air support in the South in the F-100, and they said occasionally we, especially during the Tet Offensive, we're doing a lot of night missions with flares, working really close to troops, and I felt like that was the time when you want to hang your butt out. But a lot of the targets we had weren't worth hanging your butt out, and so I think that's when you, in the heat of the battle, when you've got some adrenaline flying. It also applies to the next bullet. I did a lot of air shows, particularly when we got the Harriers, and we were always asked by the Navy or somebody to go do something. And I couldn't emphasize more how much you need to stick to your plan. This country's lost a lot of treasure and lives because of air show mishaps, and it's usually because somebody's pressing. You know, most of these airplanes, the public doesn't understand them that well. The Harrier will press you just doing routine stuff. So that was something. When you get in trouble, I've always recommended to start reducing the level of automation. Nowadays, these airplanes are so automated, there's so much augmentation on it. You've got to get back to basics. I'm rushing through these pretty fast, and I've always been told, I think I learned that at Edwards, I don't know, but it was when your airplane goes completely out of control, sometimes the best thing to do is let go of it, bend over, tie your shoe. And a lot of these airplanes will actually recover themselves pretty well if you can get out of the loop and quit aggravating the problem. And then I already covered that last one. Don't buy a used flight test airplane. Taking that pretty good. Anyway, thank you very much.